Unit 8. The Conceptual and Theoretical Issues of Power. Contents: 8.1 Introduction, 8.2 Concept of Power, 8.3 Theoretical Considerations, 8.4 The Concept of Elite, 8.5 Power, Elite and Veto Groups, 8.6 Power in Local Communities, 8.7 Conclusions, 8.8 Further Reading. Learning objectives. After going through this unit, you will be able to understand the meaning and concept of power, explain the articulation of power among the elite and in local communities, critically discuss the works of major thinkers on power. 8.1 Introduction. In simple terms, the power refers to the ability of a person to influence the behavior of another person or a group of persons in accordance with his or her own wish. In the words of Tony, power may be defined as the capacity of an individual or group of individuals to modify the conduct of other individuals or groups in a manner in which he desires and to prevent his conduct being modified in the manner in which he does not. Power heralds a relationship of subordination and superordination between people. Many social scientists, particularly sociologists, are chiefly interested in the consequences of the play of power in social relationships. In this unit, we begin with the meaning and concept of power and go on to the major theoretical approaches to the understanding of power in sociological writings. Here we briefly review the viewpoints of 6 sociologists who explain the different dimensions of power. Later in the unit, we discuss the articulation of power in two mutually opposed contexts, the elite on one hand and the local communities on the other. 8.2 Concept of Power. Power always entails a social relationship between at least two actors. It cannot be an attribute of one person. To say that an individual has power is meaningless unless it is stated over whom this power is exercised. An individual or group of individuals who hold power are able to get others to do what they want them to do. If those on whom the power is exercised resist or refuse to obey those who are powerful, they are punished in one way or the other. Power always gives rise to asymmetry in relationships. Those who have greater access to limited resources, that is, control over finances, ownership or control over means of production and or means of distributions, are more powerful than those who do not have the means of or the opportunities to control such resources. The use of sanction in imposing one's will is an important constituent of power, and it is on this count that power differs from influence. Coser, 1982, delineated two major traditions in the conceptualization of power that can be distinguished in sociological writings. The first one focus on power as the imposition of the will of actor A, who may be an individual or a collectivity, upon actor B despite B's resistance. Here, actor B is dominated by actor A. This approach may be traced in Max Weber. The second tradition focuses on power as a resource at the disposal of collectivities and use for their benefits, allowing them to make use of it to attain their objectives. Here, power is conceptualized as a collective facility. This approach may be traced to Talcott Parsons. Two questions assume relevance at this stage. Why do some people wield power while others do not? Why do some people command and others obey? At the outset, one tends to think in terms of physical might and at the outset, one tends to think in terms of physical might and strength. The stronger person wields power and commands, while the weak person does not wield power and obeys. This, however, does not hold true always. It may be said that inequality of resources leads to inequality of power. So, if the resources within a specific sphere were equally balanced, there would be no power relation between two parties. The answer to the twin questions is far more complex. It is important to know the basics of which the one who holds power claims obedience and the obedient one feels obliged to obey. Girth and Mills 1953 explained that in itself, power is simply the probability that one person will act as another person's wishes. The obedience may rest upon fear, rational calculations of advantage, lack of energy to do otherwise, loyalty, or any other reason. Dennis Wrong, 1968, comprehensively explains if an actor is believed to be powerful if he knows that others hold such a belief and if he encourages it and resolves to make use of it by intervening in or pushing actions by others who do not comply with his wishes, then he truly has power, and this power has indeed been conferred upon him by the attributions, perhaps initially without foundation, of others. A group which is unorganized, lacks common goals or common interest, and is not ready to exercise power is not treated as powerful. Often people who are in power are able to avoid the surfacing of issues that are of significance to the powerless. They are able to keep at bay the complaint of the powerless people that they are not cared of. At this stage, it is important to distinguish power from related concepts. A, power and authority. When power acquires legitimacy or justification, it is understood as authority. It may be noted that authority receives voluntary obedience. A person who has authority may exercise command or control over other persons. Take the example of a senior bureaucrat who assigns tasks to his or her subordinates and may even transfer some of them to another city. This is because the bureaucrat has the authority to do it by virtue of his or her position and status in the government machinery. In formal organization, authority is clearly specified and it dispensed through rules and laws of the organization. It may be understood at this stage that the exercise of authority does not necessarily imply the superiority of the person who commands. A teacher may be a better scholar than the principal of the school who dismisses him or her. It is simply because of the authority which vests with the principal that he or she may suspend a teacher. Power may therefore be executed in formal organization as institutionalized authority and as an institutionalized power in informal organizations. B. Power and prestige. E. A. Rose, 1916, drew attention to power as the immediate, prestige as the immediate cause of the location of power. It was said that the class which has more prestige will have most power. Prestige, therefore, is an important source of power. It is not appropriate to associate prestige with power because the prestige is usually not accompanied with the power. It itself power becomes in itself power becomes the basics of prestige. That is, when a person has power, he or she has prestige, but when a person has prestige, he or she may not have power. Power and influence. There is a close connection between power and influence. Power commands obedience and submission. Influence is persuasive rather than coercive. Power calls for intended control, which is usually executed through sanctions, while influence does not involve the use of sanctions or punishment. Influence is not essentially accompanied with power. Newton, for example, was a man of influence but no power. A policeman may have power but not influence. In the same vein, the Prime Minister of a country is a person with both power and influence. Power and dominance. Power exists and expresses itself in intergroups relations. It is associated with status that people occupy in formal organization, while dominance is associated with one's personality and may be treated as a psychological concept. Power, on the other hand, is associated with the structure of the society itself and may be treated as a sociological concept. 8.3 Theoretical consideration. The major theoretical consideration in the context of power focus on one its potential to achieve goals. Here people is treated as equivalent to dominations involving the strategy of exercising power over someone and its potential to generate solidarity and collective autonomy. Here the power is understood is in the larger framework of pursuing collective action as enfolded in the strategy of exercising power to achieve common goals. Against this backdrop, the major currents in the sociological concepts of power are discussed here. A. Max Weber, Power and Domination. According to Weber in 1940-1920, power as a general concept is distinct from domination as a specific phenomenon. Power is defined as an actor's chance to impose his or her will on another, even against the resistance of the latter in social relationship. What is interesting to note is the proposition that the degree of power is depend on the nature of submission over the one on whom it is being exercised. Stated simply, power is more if the probability of submissions to the will of the one who holds it is higher. It may be safely said that the power of an individual is measured in terms of the chances or imposing the will. Here, the basics of power of the on the or the basis of will or the basis on which the imposition of will is called for is not important. Scott explains that power is a potential that it is really realized through the actions in which an actor engages. This potential is determined by accidental or fortuitous circumstances. Example, individual has power over others because of better physique or because he or she has information that is not available to others, as much as by structurally defined opportunities and capabilities. That is, when a social distribution of social resources improves or worsens, then the chances of realizing his or her will at the disposal of an individual domination or Hashaf, on the other hand, presumes the presence of a her or master. The chief difference between power and domination is that the former does not imply the right to command and the duty to obey, while the latter implies the probability of gaining willing obedience. There are two contrasting types of dominations. The first kind of domination is one that involves a rational and calculative maneuvering of interest in one's favor. Often the individual who exercises dominations of this kind is able to convince the subordinate actors that is their interest which is being served by following him or her do what he or she is doing. This often happens when small companies sell their goods to a monopoly retail outlet. In doing so, they subject themselves to the power of the retailer, since their livelihood depends on his or her goodwill. The second type of domination is the one which is exercised by virtue of authority. Here, domination is exercised by an individual or group because it is legitimized as authority. Those on whom domination is exercised accept the commands and demands of those who dominate as basis of their own behavior. Power and domination. Weber gave particular attention to those forms of power that evolve stable and enduring relationships, and when power is situated in this way, he learned it domination. Power is structured in this way, he termed it domination. Power is structured into distinctive form of dominations through process of rationalization, power relations that were formerly matters of unreflective customs and habit because more conscious and deliberate social practices. The rationalization of action involves the replacing of the unreflective patterns of customary and habitual action by actions that are oriented towards calculation of self-interest and committed to ultimate values. Weber seems to imply two forms of rationalization which may be called respectively instrumental rationalization and value rationalization. Customary or habitual forms of social orders evolved through instrumental rationalization into forms of social order that are sustained by calculation of expediency. Through value rationalization, they became more forms of social order that are sustained by the conception of legitimacy. The power in this kind of domination emerges from the probability that the command will be obeyed. In addition, Weber distinguished between three kinds of authority: rational legal authority, which is based on norms, ordinance, and a legacy of the offices of those who exercise authority. The authority exercised by the tax collectors, policemen, bosses in the office. Traditional authority, which is based on the belief in the sacred quality of long-standing traditions and the legitimacy of those who exercise authority. The domination of the eldest person in the family and the characteristic authority, which is based on the devotion to the sacred quality, heroic strength of or extraordinary character of a person, that is authority of good man. Karl Marx and class and power. Karl Marx, Class and Power. Marx 1951-55 is known for his conception of class and class struggle. More specifically, he defines two classes: the bourgeois or the ruling class and the proletariat or the working class. In the capitalistic society, he says that the proletariat rules and commands obedience from the bourgeois. The basics of the power of the bourgeoisie is control over the capital on the one hand, and it is hold over the military force and production of ideas. In the words of Baltimore, the lines of conflicts are more sharply drawn in the modern capitalistic societies because in such societies the divergence of economic interest appears most clearly unobscured by any personal bonds such as those of feudal society, and because development of capitalism bring about a more radical polarization of classes than has existed in any other type of society by its unrivaled concentration of wealth and at one extreme of society and of poverty at the other, and by its gradual elimination of the intermediate and transitional social strata. The proletariat, on the other hand, seek to increase the power in the capital. On the other hand, seeks to increase the capital for the ruling classes. The relationship between the two classes is one of exploitation in which the ruling class gains at the expense of the wage laborers constituting the proletariat. Workers produce commodities for the bourgeois for which they receive wages. Bourgeois. Workers produce commodities for the bourgeois for which they receive wages. The wages are just enough for their subsistence. Surely there is a vast difference between the value of the commodity the workers produce and the wages what they get, this difference appropriated by the ruling class. The proletariat class is perpetually engaged in struggle over its wages and conditions of work. Earlier, the struggle was disorganized and ineffective. Modern society and factory system of production ushered an era of political organization of class struggle. The class-conscious political organization emerged. Marx's opinion that one day the proletariat will overthrow the bourgeois and get liberation from the long-standing domination and exploitation. See Robert Michael, The Iron Law of Oligarchy. Michael believed that the carving for power is inherent in the nature of human beings. Those who acquire power seeks to perpetuate it. Against this backdrop, he proposed that democracy calls for organizations which lead to oligarchy. The trend towards oligarchic rule in a party organization is better known as the Iron Law of Oligarchy. He agreed that the democratic currents of history often break even on the same shall. They are, however, ever renewed. One of the reasons for the renewal of democracy is that oligarchies were felt to be oppressive and were overthrown. Michael insists that democratic currents will always break the iron law. It may be understood that the large collectivity of people in an organization cannot govern or administer their common affairs. Over the period of time, specialization develops and divisions of labor evolves. Organizations become increasingly complex. Some people are chosen to represent the masses and execute their will. According to Michaels, every organization, however democratic in the beginning, develops an oligarchic character. He was convinced that masses await leaders to govern them and take care of their concerns. The leaders derive power from the incompetence of the masses in the domain of political life. The incompetent masses submit to the leaders of those whose expertise they are convinced. Oligarchies preserves the stability and longevity of leadership. More importantly, the oppressive conditions in themselves do not lead to unrest. It is the awareness of those conditions that generates class struggle. The struggles and revolts are often suppressed. Michael maintained that it is appropriate to ascertain the limits imposed by oligarchies over individuals. He says that the decentralization does not necessarily give way to enhanced liberty in the hands of individuals, neither does it enhance the power of the rank and file. Usually, it serves as a mechanism by which weak leaders seek to get away from the domination of the stronger ones. The weaker leaders, however, may establish a centralized authority within their own domains. One oligarchy gives way to many small oligarchies, each powerful in its own sphere. He laid trust on developing the spirit of free inquiry, criticism, and control of the leaders among the masses. It may be noted that these are imperative in the process of strengthening democracy. D. Stephen Luke's Power and Human Agency. Luke affirms that all power is attributed to individual or collective human agents. Often human agents have several options of alternatives before them for which they choose their own course of action. Human agents exercise their characteristic powers when they act voluntarily on the basis of wants and beliefs which provide them with reasons for so acting. Such an exercise of the power of human agency implies that the agent at the point of action has the power to act otherwise. That is, at the least, the ability and the opportunity both to act or not to act. It is in his power to do either. There is an openness between performing or failing to perform the action, and there is no set of external circumstances such that in those circumstances the agent will necessarily so act. Two conclusions emerge from this perspective. The one who exercised the power had the option or the alternative to act differently, and those on whom the power had the option or the alternative to act differently if power was not exercised over them. Lucas' proposition of power accepts that despite the fact that the actors operate within structurally determined limits, they have a certain degree of autonomy and could act in a degree of autonomy and in a different way. In other words, there would be no place for power in a condition of total structural determinism and imposed constraints that determine the openness of human agents. He cites the example of an employer who declares some of his workers redundant because he wants to cut costs. In other words, in other case, an official government liquidator declares an insolvent company bankrupt, which throws the workers out of the work. While the first case is a case of simple exercise of power, the second is not, because we assume that the liquidator had no alternatives before him. Lucas conclusively says that the social life may be properly understood as a dialectic of power and structure, a web of possibilities for agents to make choices and pursue strategies within given limits. E. Anthony Gidner. Power as dependency and domination. Anthony Giddens' concept of power in the context of interactions is rooted in terms of domination. He distinguishes between power in the broad sense and power in the narrow sense. In the broad sense, the power is explained as the transformative capacity of human agency. Here, the term capacity refers to the capability of an individual to bring about a change in the course of a series of events through intervention. On the other hand, power in the narrow sense is largely relational. It is the capability to affect results when these outcomes depend upon the agency of others. The basic difference between the two lies in the agency. While use of power in the broad sense and is grounded in the capability of an individual to affect outcomes directly, the use of power in the narrow sense is grounded in the capability to affect the outcomes in situations when they depend upon others. More specifically, in the narrow sense, power implies dependency upon the agency of others and the capability of an individual to prevail upon them. The thrust is on domination on the part of the individual, who may be said to hold power and compliance on the part of others over whom the individual exercises control. This relationship then may be understood as one of the domination. Thus, Giddens writes it in the sense that the men have power over other. This is power as domination. Giddens's basic concept of power has to do with acquisition and use of resources or capabilities expressed in struggles and subordination. In Giddens' own words, power in either the broad or restricted senses refers to capabilities. Unlike the communication of meaning, power does not come into being only when being exercised. Even if ultimately there is no other criterion, thereby one can demonstrate what powers across possess. This is important because we can talk of power being stored up for future occasions of use. Later, Giddens suggests that reproduction of structures of domination leads to generation of power. Power therefore depends upon the distribution of resources and the capability of individuals to make the most of them effectively. He upholded that in actual situations, everyone does have possibilities of exercising power. An individual in a subordinate position is never completely dependent. He is often able to convert the available resources into some degree of control over the conditions of reproduction of the system. Giddens opines that power is not always oppressive. In fact, power may best be understood as the capacity to achieve outcomes. In fact, power flows smoothly in process of social reproduction in the large matrix of structures of domination. More importantly, despite the fact that the constraints of power cannot be ignored, the power is often a media for attaining freedom or emancipation. F. Michael Foucault. Power as domination. Michael Foucault identifies power with domination in conceptual, methodological, and political terms. He distinguishes between the characteristic of modern and classical power within the framework of domination. Disciplinary power as modern form of domination stand out in sharp contrast with the sovereign power as pre-modern domination. Firstly, while disciplinary power is constant and completely pervasive, sovereign power is periodic, therefore not constant, and low social penetration, therefore not pervasive. Secondly, while domination in the disciplinary model makes the required action happen through political rationalities and technologies of power, that seems to be inescapable, domination in the sovereignty model is expressed through prohibition, and if that fails, the punishment for the action which should not have been performed. Thirdly, while in the disciplinary model there is contrasting constitutions of actors, subjectivization in the sense of control and dependence. The sovereignty model is based on the givenness of the actors involved. In other words, Foucault himself this modern form of power applies itself to everyday life, which categories the individual, marks him by his own individuality, attaches him to his own identity, imposes a law of truth on him, which he must recognize and which others have to recognize in him. It is a form of power which makes individual subjects. There are two meanings of the word subject: subject to someone else by control and dependence, and tied to him own identity by a consensus or self-knowledge. Both meaning suggest a form of power which subjugates and makes subject to. This implies that the law of truth constitutes the defining criterion of modern form of power. Further, modern form of power is based on relations of domination, hierarchy, asymmetry, and control. He maintains that new form of domination developed, and he argued that the liberation of freedom, both at the individual level and at the collective level, from the constraints is not possible. According to him, global public orientation, emancipatory politics is not possible. Surely, Foucault has been charged with a kind of fatalism inherent in the competition of power. 8.4 The concept of elite. In a general sense, the term elite was employed to refer to commodities of particular excellence. The structured usage of the term in the 17th century has broadened later to include modern groups such as higher ranks of mobility, and others that could be treated as superior to the rest of them. It was only in the later part of the 19th century that the term gained a currency in sociological writing in Europe. In 1930, sociological theories of elite developed in Britain and America, particularly in the writing of Wilfredo Pareto. Pareto 1935 explained that the concept of elite, the terms of a class of people with the highest indices, referring to the sign of capacity, that is, a successful lawyer has highest index, one who does not get a client has the lowest index in their branch of activity. This class of people is referred as the elite. In some more simple terms, Pareto defined the elite by reference to facts which an outside observer is able to verify. Elite class therefore comprise of all those who have succeeded and are considered by their peers and the public as the best. When he spoke of the elite consistency, Pareto did not mean all of those who have succeeded, both those who exercise the political functions of administrations or government and those who influence of determine the conduct of governing machinery through they are not officials or ministers. There are two categories: the non-elite, who may or may not have a role to play in the government, and the elite. The later category, that is the elite, is divided into governing elite and non-governing elite. The elite class is divisible into two classes. The governing elite constitute of people who have some say or who directly or indirectly play a part in the government, and the non-governing elite are constituted of the rest of the elite, that is those who have to say or no role to play in the government. Pareto argued that the same individuals occupy the same rank in hierarchy for wealth as for other criteria such as musical talent, level of intelligence, and so on, and for the degree of political and social influences. This implies that the upper class are also the richest entities, these classes that represents the elite. Later, Pareto concerned himself with those who have power, that is, governing elite and the masses. Pareto, however, recognized the element of mobility in the elite class. That is, he did not insist that the elite was a static category which was constituted once and for all. He propounded the idea of circulations of elite, There are at least two channels through which the idea of circulation of elite may be explained. Circulation of elite refers to the process in which the individuals circulate between the elite and the non-elite groups. It is also referred to the process in which one elite is replaced by another. Pareto's works incorporate both the conceptions, but the former conception referring to the circulation of individuals between elite and non-elite groups predominate. In the context of decay and renewal of aristocracies, Veto observed the governing class is restored not only in numbers but, and it is that the more important thing, in quality, by families rising from a lower class. Apart from this, he also makes mention of slowing down of this circulation, which leads to increase of degenerate elements in the class, which still hold power, and increase in the elements of superior quality in the subject classes. In such a situation, social equilibrium becomes unstable. Even a mild shock may be enough to crumble it. A new elite comes to power and establish a new equilibrium after a conquest of a revolution. Pareto also repeated refers to circulation of individuals between the elite and non-elite class. He suggested that the governing class constituting the elite might induct those people in the lower power cases from whom they perceive the threat or danger. When thus people are inducted into the elite group, they change their character completely and adopt the attitude and interests of the established elite. Maria Kolabinska, a student of Pareto, identified circulation which takes place between different categories of governing elite itself, and circulation which takes place between the elite and the rest of the population. Individuals from lower strata may manage to enter the existing elite class, or individuals in the lower strata may be from new elite groups which engaged in a struggle for power with the existing elite. Kolabinska's work, largely devoted to the study of circulation of elite in French society, focused between the 11th and 18th centuries, cited from Botomore 1964. Gaetano Mosca was the first to draw a distinction between the elite and the masses. He explained that in all societies there are two classes of people, one that rules and the other that is ruled. The class which rules performs all political functions, monopolizes power, and enjoys all the advantages and privileges that accompany power. The class which is ruled larger in terms of numeration, compensation, and is governed and controlled by the other class through legal, sometimes arbitrary and violent means. Like Pareto, Mosca was also concerned with elites as groups of people vested with political power. Mosca explained that between the elite and the masses is the category of sub-elite constituted of the new middle class of civilian servants, managers, and white-collar workers, scientists, engineers, scholars, and intellectuals. The sub-elite provides new recruits to the elite class. The sub-elite itself is a vital element in the government of society. Mosca suggested that the stability of any political system largely depend on the level of morality, intelligence, and activity that this second stratum has attained. He accounted for the rise of new elite in part by emergence of social forces, which represent new interest, that is, technological or economical interest in the society. 8.5 Power Elite and Veto Groups. In the context of power in America, C. Wright Mills, 1956, proposed the concept of power elite, explained in terms of a unified power group composed of top government executives, military officials, and corporation directors, while David Reisman, 1953, proposed the concept of veto groups, explained in terms of a diversified and balanced plurality of interest groups, each of which is primarily concerned with protecting its jurisdiction by blocking actions of other groups, which seems to threaten that jurisdiction. Connors compares Mills and Reisman on power in America along 5 dimensions. 1. Structure of power, including how power is distributed among the major segments of present-day American society. Mills proposed that pyramid of power may be conceived as form of 3 layers. The apex is occupied by power elite. The second layer is occupied by the middle levels of power, constituted of diversified and balanced plurality of interest groups, while the third layer is occupied by mass society, constituted of powerless mass of unorganized people who are controlled from above. Reisman, on the other hand, proposed a pyramid formed of 2 rather than 3 layers. Reisman did not recognize the presence of power elite. The upper layer is occupied by 2 veto groups. Here, instead of decisive ruling group, is a amorphous structure of power centering in the interplay among interest groups that form the veto groups. The lower layer of the pyramid comprises more or less the unorganized public, which cooperates with and is not dominated the interest group in their maneuvers against actual or threatened encroachment on the jurisdiction each claims for itself. 2. Changes in the structure of power, including how the distribution of power has changed in the course of American history. Mills lay emphasis on increasing concentrations of power and the ascending of power elite, while Rain lays emphasis in increasing dispersions of power and the tendency towards the dispersal of power among plurality of organized interest. Operations of the structure of power, including the means whereby the power is exercised in American society. According to Mills, the power elite lays down all important public policies, particularly foreign policy. The power elite manipulate the power at the bottom. Reisman, on the other hand, denied what Mills asserted. He said that who determines the policy largely depend on the issue about which policy is being laid out. Group consulting veto groups are largely cooperative on several issues. Most of them become active in making decisions and laying out policies about issues that concerns them or are of interest to them. This implies that there are as many power structures as the spheres of policy. For the basis of structure of power, including how social and psychological factors shape and sustain the existing distribution of power, it is understandable that the power is shared among who share common interest. For Mills, the power elite represents a body of people with common interest. For Reisman, the veto groups have diversity of interest. 5. Consequences of the structure of power, including how the existing group distribution of power affects American society. Mills said that the interest of major institution, corporation, armed forces, and executive branch of government, whose leaders constitute the power elite, are greatly enhanced in the existing power arrangements because of the concentration of power in the hands of the selected few and manipulation for exercising power. There is decline of politics as public debate. See, concentration of power has taken place without a corresponding shift in the base of legitimacy of power. Power is supposed to reside in the hands of public and its elected representatives, while in reality it lies in the hand of those who direct the key bureaucracies. Consequently, men of power are neither responsible nor accountable for their power. And D. If power tends to a small group which is not accountable for its power, and if the politics no longer involves genuine public debate, then there will be a severe weakening of democratic institutions. Conversely, Reisman said that no one group or class is favored in a major way over the others. Politics has declined in meaning for many people, which is not essentially due to the ascending of veto groups. There is growing discrepancy between the facts of power and images of power. Power is more widely dispensed than in generally believed, and power in America is institutional and mercurial. It is amorphous, because of which there is decline of effective leadership. 8.6 Power in local communities. The focus of community power is on decisions that are crucial to the people in a community. The basic question, therefore, is who wields the power to say about things which are important to many people in the community. The concern is with the ability to and or the practice of deciding what is to be done in for by the community. Box 8.2 Motivation for decision making. In the relatively pluralistic American community, power over decision is not an automatic reflection of a prescribed hierarchical role description. A significant variable that emerges from the literature in the motivation to intervene in a particular decision making process. Such motivation is simply a product of the extent to which that decision is salient to the group and or the individual. Two scholars who have contributed significantly to the subject of community power are Delbert Miller and Robert Dahl, C.D. Antonio and J. N. Leach, 1961. They have initiated a debate based on their own studies and research. The basic issue of contention is who holds power over local communities. Miller asserts that the business elite makes decisions in local communities. Dahl, on the other hand, argues that rather than being monolithic, power structure is pluralistic. We will discuss the critical features of the power of the 2 points of view in some detail now. Delbert Miller chose knowledgeable informants from the community. He asked them to select out of a prepared list of important, well-known people belonging to different organizations and institutions, those whom they thought were powerful in getting things done. Now Miller interviewed the people who were selected by the knowledgeable informants. He also asked them whose help they could seek if they wanted to get something done. This was referred to as a reputational techniques. Miller concluded that the most of the knowledgeable informants, he said businessmen, were the one who could get things done. They do influence policy making in local communities to a large extent. Here, local governments are not strong bodies and elected officials are often businessmen, lawyers and politicians of the community itself. This was true of the Pacific city. A study of the English city, however, suggested on Miller that not businessmen but labor is significant as also leaders from the domain of education, religion and welfare and status groups. Based on the two of the above mentioned studies, Miller concluded that the power pattern is not essentially identical in all American communities. Robert Dahl studied New Haven. In his methodology of research differed sharply from that of Miller. Dahl found out that specific decision on specific issues. What is more important is that he looked for specific decision makes in specific situations too. This technique was referred to as even analysis. He concluded that the role of a businessman in decision making was minor in contrast to the assertion of Miller. He explained that while there is no denying that businessmen have a lot of resources at their disposal, but is in equality true that they have several liabilities by which they are constrained and because of which they cannot emerge as the major contributor in decision making process. Therefore, not one center of power but many loci of power exist. Dahl believes that the mayors and their staff have increasingly become the initiator and organization of important community decisions. Miller insists that the political leaders are uncertain about themselves and wait for the cues from others, while businessmen have a clearly defined image and act with more assertion. Apart from Miller and Dahl, Edward Benfield in 1961 made a significant contribution in the domain of the community power by studying 6 specific community problems in Chicago. He reached to the conclusion that surely the businessmen in Chicago occupying top position in the national corporation and regional commercial and banking institutions are endowed with resources that give them unlimited power, yet the businessmen do not dominate critical community decisions. The chief reasons for abstaining from this sphere is lack of unity and of interest and cost initiated entirely in making interventions. They seems to be satisfied and let go of situation if their vested interests are not at stake. On the other hand, if their personal interests are threatened or jeopardized, they become excessively involved and use their influence in affecting a decision. Banfield agrees with Delt in upholding that the chief decision of Chicago are taken by managers of large organizations, few civic leaders, and the chief elected officials. Banfield seems to consider the political leader as potential omnipotent when they go all out on any decision. This calls for using up their limited working capital and coming on into confrontation with other power groups besides national government, businessmen, other strong community elements that may be affected and take an opposite stand. They therefore are slow to take up issues and often look for compromises. 8.7 Conclusion. It is evident that the notion of power, so commonly used in day-to-day parlance, have many dimensions and operated in many different ways. Sociologists have conceptualized the power in terms of domination as a perceived and oppressive force, as also an enabling force, enabling resource. Power has, we have noted, addressed both with the elite and with the local community. Power enfolds a dynamism of sorts in its very nature and regulates nearly all relationships in the society, which make it of a special interest to sociologists. We have further reading in 8.8. There is many books name has been given, two books names there. An analysis of social power and in sociological theory, a book of reading edited by Louis Kosser and Bernard Rosenberg. Another book is Power and Democracy in America. And there are few different are available.